Hello, everyone. My name is Jan. I am a doctoral student in social work from the University of Toronto. The title of my talk today is Decolonizing the Stories We Tell about Human Trafficking Survivors. So, for about over 5 years before I started my doctoral studies, I had an opportunity to work in New York, providing counseling and direct services to over hundreds of migrant women who were identified as trafficking survivors. Myself, as a migrant woman, identified as Chinese, and as a social worker, I was assigned to a lot of Asian women clients who were coming from the regions where Chinese is spoken as the primary language. So I remember while I was working there, one day a colleague of mine who was working on a yearly report for the organization came to me and asked if I could help write up a survivor narrative for the report. So thinking about that idea, I felt like as I work so closely with these women, I know them really well. And I am often considered as an expert in my Asian or Chinese culture. So it wouldn't be a difficult task at all. So, however, when I began to craft a narrative, even just thinking through one person's life story, it was extremely complex and there were so many elements. So it was very hard for me to decide on what to take or what to leave, not even think about the diversity in the lived experiences of so many women that I worked with. So very quickly, I realized it was almost impossible to synthesize a narrative that, in a way, represents my Chinese clients. So eventually, I did come up with a story for the report, a story that was pretty much like this one that I found in the Global Trafficking in Persons report published last year. When Lynn was 14 years old, she went to Dubai with her uncle, who promised to take care of her. However, her uncle forged her passport to make her appear older. When she arrived in Dubai, her uncle forced her to engage in commercial sex. When she tried to refuse, her traffickers beat her until she complied. And finally, the local police raided the venue, arrested her uncle, and took her to a local shelter for protection and support services. Well, I did manage to come up with a story, and in fact, I continued to write many more similar stories. I did start to struggle with this idea about telling or writing a client story. It felt like I would never be able to give a full picture or tell a complete story of even just one person. And I also wondered if some of my clients got to read these stories that I wrote, would the story be resonating with them? And if they felt uncomfortable, would they tell me? About 2 years ago, in one of my doctoral qualitative courses, in one session, we were learning about postcolonial theories and theories related to representation. So I got a chance to read a classic work by Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? It was fascinating for me to learn about this concept of subaltern. It refers to a group or a community of people who are colonized and who are positioned outside of the dominant hierarchies of power and are constantly being represented by the authorities or other groups or even by their own community members who were selected as the representatives speaking or writing on behalf of them. So this concept resonated with me so much in a way that I felt like it provided me with a form of language or a lens through which I can revisit my previous storytelling practice. So last year, using this concept of subaltern and other post-colonial theories of representation, I did a critical discourse analysis study where I was trying to understand how social service providers tell stories of trafficking survivors. And so I used a sample of narratives used and posted on the websites of 10 anti-trafficking social service providers based in the state of New York. By analyzing these narratives, I found that there were four dominant discursive elements that were being pervasively included in many of these narratives. So the first one was about the adversities that happened in survivors' home countries, such as survivors being abused. They were experiencing different hardships, and often in a country located in the global south. The second one was about their family members, their friends, or strangers, also in their home country, who were playing a role of facilitating the trafficking process or being their traffickers. The third one was about survivors in trafficking experiences, often described as being full of mental or physical abuse, and their extremely unbearable living conditions, their lack of awareness of the surroundings, or not knowing what to do in that situation. And the last one was about survivors' life transformation after receiving services from the providers. And also, these narratives were very often used along with educational information about trafficking, description of services, or donation requests. So, putting all these elements together, it kind of constructed a narrative or a master narrative where migration, especially the migration of women, is a risky process. In certain countries, and especially the countries located in the global south, are a risky place with a lot of dangerous people. And the victims appear to be ignorant, vulnerable, and are waiting to be rescued. And very unfortunately, this master narrative also coincides with how trafficking survivors have been portrayed by the dominant social media and in documentaries and films. It is not my intention to say that these elements are untrue or to minimize the impact of trafficking on survivors or to deny the criminal responsibility of their traffickers. However, my concern is that there are only certain elements of their lived experiences or selected to make a story by us to fulfill certain purposes. And at the same time, certain parts of their stories are constantly being dismissed in our storytelling. So I name this talk Decolonizing the Stories That We Tell About Trafficking Survivors. So I think a critical first step in this decolonizing process is to engage ourselves in a genuine and ongoing reflection about our own positionalities and intentionalities when we tell stories of other individuals. I think we may need to critically reflect on our own positions of power and the kinds of stories or knowledge that we are producing or reproducing to the field. For example, how our professional or social locations or identities, our knowledge systems, and our ideological beliefs are contributing to the types of stories that we are telling. When we are telling stories about trafficking survivors or any different groups of people, whose stories are we telling? And if we are inviting a client or a survivor to write or speak on behalf of their own communities, whose stories are we inviting this person to tell? And to what audience groups? With what motivations and for what purposes? Another important part of the decolonizing process is also to acknowledge that each individual has the ultimate ownership of their own lived experiences. And so they should have the ultimate power to decide on or initiate how, when, where, and which part of their lived experiences can or cannot be shared, to whom, and for what purposes. As social work practitioners and researchers, we are committed to social and structural justice. So our commitment to social justice will not be complete if we do not confront our own biases, limitations, and motivations in our production of knowledge or storytelling. So this critical reflection process or self-confrontation is a lifelong process, and I think it's very challenging and uncomfortable, but I think it is worthwhile. So thank you for listening to this talk, and here's my contact information. I hope everyone stays well.